Condemned Criminal Origins is a visceral, violent experience, a bloody tale of a city's darkest corners and the horrors hidden within. Developed by Monolith Productions and released alongside the Xbox 360, it's a harrowing affair that is still remarkably effective in the present, a title I'd recommend every horror fan samples. It's long in the tooth by video game standards, but age definitely hasn't lessened its blunt force trauma. Condemned is reflective of a transformation horror cinema underwent during the decade or two prior to the game's 2005 release. Slasher movies and the extremely violent exploits of Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees and the like had once captured moviegoers' imaginations, but as the mid-90s and early noughties rolled around, the exploits of hapless teens and the masked men hunting them had become too predictable. Halloween 24, This Time It's Personal, and Friday the 13th Part 11, Jason Takes Hawaii, no longer put bums on seats like they'd once been able to. It wasn't the end of the world for horror fans though, as a new brand of terror soon emerged in response, one more grounded and less cliché, but which still contained echoes of the past. Think Silence of the Lambs, think Seven or Saw, macabre thrillers about serial killers operating in environments coated in a thick layer of grime. Condemned is for all intents and purposes the video game equivalent, an unsettling exploration of an underworld where very bad people lurk around every corner and things go bump in the night with alarming regularity. Like many movies in the aforementioned serial killer thriller subgenre, Condemned begins with a murder. Police have discovered a body in a dilapidated building located in a less than desirable part of setting Metro City, with FBI agent Ethan Thomas dispatched to investigate. Upon further examination of the scene, he deduces that the crime is the grisly handiwork of serial killer The Matchmaker, whose MO is killing young women before posing them with mannequins. Wafts of smoke signalling that the Matchmaker may still be nearby, Ethan and a pair of his colleagues set off in hot pursuit, but it all ends in tears as he is disarmed and his gun is used to kill his backup before he is promptly thrown out of a window.
Thomas!
And the path takes strange turns.
Police! Drop the weapon now!
Be ready for death, Agent Thomas. It shall come visiting again.
Waking in his apartment, a family friend, the mysterious Malcolm Van Horn, warns Ethan that the police are laying the blame for his colleagues' murders squarely at his feet. Right on cue, they arrive to arrest Ethan, but he escapes by the skin of his teeth, venturing out into the night determined to clear his name. I don't think it's unreasonable to describe Condemned's gameplay across the 4 to 5 hours which follows as relatively mechanically simplistic, mostly tiptoeing but sometimes reluctantly sprinting through an endless parade of godforsaken locales, including dingy department stores, sinister subways and frightening farms. You'll spend most of your time doing two things. Inspecting crime scenes is the activity you'll indulge in much less frequently. Every so often you'll come across an area containing evidence. Sometimes it's the scene of a murder, on other occasions it's little more than a splash of questionable fluid, a fingerprint or similar, and you'll then need to channel your inner crime scene investigator to find and catalogue it. It sounds brilliant on paper, but in execution it's paper thin. No matter the tool, no matter the task, all you need to do is hit a button to bring out the necessary piece of equipment, line things up, and then hit the same button again to finish the job. Objective accomplished, Ethan will almost always then send the data to colleague Rosa Angel for analysis.
Human tissue. Color, adipose deposits, and adjacent facial hair stubble indicate that these are human lips and facial skin. Also, I've run the faculty list. The gym teacher at your location during Carl Anderson's tenure was a man by the name of Samuel Tibbets. And before you ask, yes, Tibbets' medical records provided his blood type. It's a match with the facial tissue.
Rosa is one of few at the Bureau who remains loyal to the disgraced protagonist, and her insights are used to help drive the story forward. Engaging then, it is not, but it is at least the source of the game's best scare. At the end of the department store chapter, you have to examine a dead body, and the whole time you'll likely be on the edge of your seat, expecting it to suddenly move. It doesn't happen though, not in the department store anyway. A few levels later you do the same again, but your guard will probably be down. After all, nothing happened the first time. Then bam!
Help me!
Only once does the crime scene concept blossom into something compelling beyond its initial premise or a brief scare during Condemned's penultimate level. Writing is scrawled all over the walls, floors and ceilings of a house, with trails of letters leading you to 4 different parts of the residence where segments of a riddle you need to solve are located. It isn't interesting enough that it justifies the mechanic's earlier monotony, but it demonstrates potential. Arriving too late in the day, it is potential Monolith ran out of time to truly capitalise on, but tweaks were included in Condemned 2 Bloodshot. It's one of the best parts of a sequel of varying quality, with deductions needing to be made based on evidence found and a list of choices provided. The most astute detectives will unlock upgrades and extra story details if their conclusions are proven correct, adding both agency and consequence to what was previously an underdeveloped mechanic. Whenever you're not solving crimes, which is the majority of the time, you'll be busting heads. You're going to be whacking enemies with pipes, whacking them with axes, whacking them with hammers, and even whacking them with mannequin arms. You're going to be whacking away like a little monkey. There are many melee weapons on offer, and you'll usually go no more than a minute without finding one. Each has different stats, the 4 categories being damage, speed, block and reach, and you're only able to carry one at a time. There isn't a staggering amount of difference between many of them, but I personally tended to gravitate towards pipes due to their well-rounded stats, while drawers, planks and doors are usually avoided as they take up half the blooming screen. The mechanics of combat aren't overly complex. One button is for cracking skulls, with one of 4 attacks used depending on the direction you're moving, and another is for stopping your skull from being cracked. If you time your block correctly, it will also stun your opponent so that you can deliver a flurry of blows of your own. The big issue with parrying is that it requires you to get too close to your attacker for comfort. During my recent playthrough, I quickly learned that to negate that risk, the optimal approach was to move backwards to avoid incoming swings and then charge forward to retaliate. If you're lucky, once enough damage has been done, baddies will also drop to their knees, giving you the opportunity to perform a merciless finishing move. While it looks cool and fits Condemned's grim tone, I remain unconvinced that an FBI agent should really be sauntering around casually snapping homeless people's necks. It's an aspect of the story that is actually an interesting twist, and it's one not capitalised on anywhere near as much as it maybe should have been. Ethan is a man of the law, or he was at one point, focused on helping prevent violent crime, yet suddenly he is forced to rely on brutality himself. He has no choice but to incapacitate or kill his attackers. It's a dog-eat-dog world, and Ethan won't survive without being the biggest, meanest dog. But as we'll get to later, it's made quite clear that his aggressors are not of sound mind and can't necessarily be blamed for their actions. It's a fascinating moral quandary that is unfortunately never explored in any great depth. You will also come across firearms to complement the many blunt objects at your disposal, but they are in short supply, especially during Condemned's first half. However many bullets a gun has when you pick it up is however many you'll have to use, and with there being no on-screen ammo counter or crosshair, not only do you need to keep track of how many shots you have left, you also have to concentrate fully on hitting your target. It's all fun and games, blasting away with reckless abandon until you realise you're empty, your attacker is still alive, and you end up with a 2x4 embedded somewhere in your anatomy. Firearms can be used as melee weapons too, but it's not recommended. Ethan does have an ace up his sleeve which can be deployed no matter the situation, his taser. It is the most useful tool in his arsenal. Guns may come and go, but your taser is forever, with a 10-second recharge all that stands between you and your next shot. You can use it to get a few free hits in while the poor soul on the receiving end fizzes away, or if you like what they're carrying, you can stroll right up to them and steal their weapon. That is a very useful strategy when facing foes with firearms who can damage you from a distance, as it allows you to quickly and safely close the gap between you and them. I think its cooldown should have been considerably longer though. More often than not during early levels, you'll be taking on one enemy at a time, and with breaks for you to catch your breath between encounters common, the taser will pretty much always be at your disposal. It has the potential to trivialise conflict during a period it should leave you most panic-stricken, those tense early stages when you're still learning how the game works and are figuring out your combat strategy. That's a real shame, as there's nothing quite like those frantic early brawls. Later on, it also gets upgraded to a super taser, which breaks the game even further.
Oh, and I also left something there on the counter for you. Popular modification to the standard taser.
Its effects magnified, enemies collapse in a heap upon impact, leaving most vulnerable to a one-whack knockout. Against weaker enemies, you sometimes don't even need to follow up, the huge pulse of electricity being more than enough to put them down permanently. The game tries in vain to offset the enormous power increase by throwing more adversaries in larger groups your way. However, barring the odd encounter, they won't pose too big a threat. I'm 99% sure Monolith was aware of its imbalance too. The super taser is taken away from you prior to Condemned's final level beginning, an acknowledgement perhaps that yes, maybe it is a bit too useful. Even in 2023, there are few developers who have mastered the art of designing robust first-person melee combat, and that's not wholly surprising. It's a tough nut to crack. Monolith's take is excellent, and despite it being simplistic compared to some modern examples, it still holds up to scrutiny today. There's no secret ingredient here, a specific special something that makes Condemned scuffles unique. Rather, its success is down to how cohesively lots of little things combine. Tangles with the various monstrosities you encounter during your travels feel surprisingly personal thanks to a low field of view giving them a larger-than-life presence, and most melee weapons, even those with more reach, require you get so close that if it were real life you'd be able to smell your enemy's stinking breath. Ethan also isn't the quickest to move through areas, even when taking advantage of his ability to temporarily sprint, and his plodding walk speed is matched by the way he swings his weapons. His attacks are slow and deliberate, every swing delivered with deadly intent, the result a brutal thump as metal and wood collide with bone. Each encounter is a fight for your life, and there's no room for theatrics, with teeth flying and blood staining your weapon. Combat is grounded to the point you can almost feel each killing blow as it's delivered. As visceral as many of your endeavours may be, man cannot live by savagery alone, with a modicum of intelligence and quick-wittedness also expected of you. Monolith are best known for FPS Fear, released the same year as Condemned, which was lauded for its remarkable AI. I've no idea if there was any development crossover, but it wouldn't surprise me as the same attention is paid to the way enemies behave in Criminal Origins. Sometimes they will feint an attack and then pounce when your guard is lowered after an unnecessary block, and they'll shield themselves from your swings and counter-attack when you do make contact. Putting to one side the taser and Ethan's finishing blows, they are able to use all the same moves you can, which makes them extremely dangerous no matter the circumstances. They also have a few tricks of their own. At first, they might not seem like a clever bunch, mostly charging in your general direction as soon as they lay eyes on you, but you'll soon begin to notice some disturbing behaviour. Every so often, they'll do a runner and lie in wait somewhere. You know they're about and that they'll make an appearance soon enough, but when and where is a mystery, and that never fails to be terrifying, except for when they occasionally do a rubbish job of it. If one of your foes finds themselves weaponless, they'll also search for something nearby to batter you with. They'll take advantage of cover and will flank when the possibility arises. Condemned's hallways tend to be narrow and linear, so they'll generally struggle to get the drop on you, but that's no bad thing, as when they do, it's always a real heart-in-mouth moment. Group dynamics come into play as well. If you're confronted by a gaggle of very angry antagonists, you have three options. You can run headfirst into trouble, plank in hand, and you'll probably be beaten half to death in a matter of seconds. Fighting a single enemy is tricky enough, taking on 2, 3 or more in one go is a death sentence. Dipping only a toe into an area to try and coax one member of the pack over at a time is the most viable way of dealing with the challenge. It's a solid strategy that makes what would otherwise be a very tough situation much more manageable. As counterintuitive as it sounds, not doing anything at all can often be the best course of action too. If you simply stop, wait and watch, there's a good chance a squabble might break out among your enemies, leaving you with little to do beyond cleaning up any weakened stragglers once the dust has settled. If one or more of them are equipped with firearms, then all bets are off. As mentioned, my advice would be to use the taser to disarm one of them as quickly as you possibly can, and then focus on any others equipped with guns in the immediate vicinity using your own shooter. Angry vagrants hanging out in groups aren't your only issue either, they come in a variety of shapes and sizes too. You've got your normal one, your fast one, your bigger so hits harder one, with a later enemy type trespassers even communicating to some degree. Strategy varies somewhat between them, but don't expect a vastly transformed combat experience. I found the majority of my decision making was dictated by the amount of space available to me and what weapons were being wielded. When it was safe to move in, when I needed to keep my distance, and whether firearms were in gameplay were what I always paid most attention to. That description is a tad reductive, to be fair, and there are some moments when certain enemy types are used to great effect. Exploring the subway tunnels, for example, these slight but nimble rejects rattle around in the rafters above you, jumping down to begin their assault when you least expect it. The aforementioned trespassers, the thinking man's vagabond, are a good test too, this outdoor set piece later in the game being a particularly challenging test of your reflexes and ability to manage space. A video game wouldn't be a video game without the obligatory boss fight or two either, and while Condemned mostly steers clear of such over-the-top affairs, a wise choice in my view, you will take on a couple of superpowered monsters. In the school, you'll come across this hulking cafeteria worker who rumbles towards you wielding a meat cleaver, known as the Butcher. The Butcher soon becomes the Butchered though, with the lovely lady presenting little challenge due to her slow movement and difficulty navigating obstacles. There's also the Hate, this gorgeous geezer who looks like he's been torn straight from a Hellraiser movie. He's nimble and hits hard, and the challenge he presents somewhat justifies his inclusion, even if the reason for him existing at all, which I'll get to shortly, is stupid. When I started writing this script, I didn't expect to spend quite as long as I have chatting about Condemned's combat, but I hope in a way that helps drive home just how highly I regard it. It's not the most nuanced, do not go in expecting to pull off a string of crazy first-person combos, nor does it ever evolve much beyond its initial offering, but a lack of complexity or evolution is not by default a negative. Considering the game's short runtime, it does exactly what it needs to do, keeping proceedings varied enough that the impact of its viciousness never begins to fade. The environments within which this cacophony of violence unfolds are distinctly horrible. A mix of narrow hallways where you'll normally fight one enemy at a time, and larger rooms where more chaotic skirmishes tend to break out. Condemned's aesthetic is consistent and miserable. Wallpaper peels, metal rusts, and many buildings look like they're on the verge of collapse. We're not privy to what the rest of Metro City looks like, but the part we do see is clearly on life support, or may already be a lost cause, one which should probably be left to fester until the weight of the horrors it contains causes it to eventually crumble completely. I love that most of the locations you visit would have once been part of everyday life for many. The office building, the department store, the library, and even the subway system used to ferry people between them. Places of business, consumerism, and enlightenment now all lie empty, devoid of any intelligent life. Aside from the odd police officer, you only encounter those out for blood within them, and those people feel like an extension of the environment itself. Twisted and warped by their bleak surroundings, those who remain are a manifestation of the rot, the city's sagging underbelly lashing out at anyone who dares trespass. Every environment has a coating of misery and despair, the inhabitants lurking in the shadows a constant reminder that no matter where you look, everything is falling apart. Clearing an area of evildoers is ultimately an exercise in futility, like wiping the bloodstains from a dead body. It might look a little cleaner, but a corpse is still a corpse. You do at least have a torch you can use to illuminate even the gloomiest corners, which provides some relief. Although, aside from the consistently overpowered taser, which basically turns you into Thor, the slum's god of lightning, for me it's the biggest miss in the entire game. For darkness to be truly scary, there needs to be occasions when you have no choice but to be enveloped by it, as long as it's not overdone to the point navigation becomes frustrating. Horror masterpiece Amnesia: The Dark Descent is a great example of a title which gets the balance right. Your lantern provides light, but it runs on oil, which is in limited supply, and wandering around in the shadows leads to you losing your mind, which means it's vital you choose the right moments to have it turned on or off. Something so fundamental being a limited resource creates relentless, inescapable tension. In comparison, Ethan's flashlight never runs out of battery, even for a second. You turn it on at the start of the game and will likely leave it on until the end credits roll without there being any punishment whatsoever. How light and dark are used is a facet of the game's aesthetic I still think looks gorgeous, with only patches of certain areas lit up ahead to create immense feelings of uncertainty. This aspect of its visuals is still incredibly effective, despite the game showing its age graphically, which is hardly surprising considering it's 18 years old. The problem is, you might never experience it, as there's zero downside to using your flashlight. It would have been such an easy fix too. All Monolith needed to do was put it on a cooldown like the taser, or have it use batteries you had to hunt for. Consequently, it could be argued the flashlight actively detracts from the game's atmosphere on occasion, as its usefulness in every situation means you might never even see a lot of the world the way the artists who crafted it envisioned. Even if you're made of stern stuff and are able to remain somewhat composed in the face of such disturbing events, Condemned's tremendous sound design could well be what finally pushes you over the edge. You spend most of your time alone with only your adversaries for comfort, bar the appearance of the odd NPC and a single level spent working alongside Rosa, and Monolith never lets you forget that. Much of the suspense comes from diegetic audio, the muffled sounds of footsteps in the distance, loud bangs as objects are knocked over by unseen entities, or the roars of those who realise there's an intruder in their midst. Your flashlight is the most important tool for keeping track of bloodthirsty individuals in your immediate vicinity, but to effectively track threats further away, you'll need to use your ears. As quietly as you creep through environments, as alert as you are to any danger, combat is inevitable and equally aurally disconcerting. Weapons swoosh satisfyingly as they're swung, followed swiftly by thuds and cracks which will make you wince. Enemies groan in pain when you make contact and scream and shout as they attempt to do the same. It's another way they're made to feel like real people, which is integral to combat landing as well as it does. Loneliness is a powerful emotion, and you'd be forgiven for assuming that Monolith would attempt to amplify it by leaving you to wallow in silence in between encounters. After all, loneliness and silence go hand in hand like a deranged man and a metal pipe to the cranium. There is some music, the catchy theme tune being the most memorable number, but pieces fleshed out enough to call songs are few and far between. I listened to the whole of Condemned's OST and counted only 4 tracks longer than 2 minutes out of 44 in total, with some of the other 40 clocking in around a minute and most a lot less. Even the 4 more fleshed out ditties are variations of the game's theme too, but that still doesn't mean you play in silence. Music, and calling it music is a stretch, is a mix of discordant hums, groans and unsettling tones. Most tracks may be more ambient in nature, but they will make you feel desperately uneasy regardless. They remind me of the sorts of sounds most horror games will use in the lead up to a big scare, to ensure you're sufficiently rattled for the big fright which follows so it makes as big an impact as possible. Except in Criminal Origins, it's like that 99% of the time. It makes your travels utterly excruciating, and it allows the situational audio to shine. In amongst all the wonderfully distressing parts of Condemned I've spoken about so far, there is one big negative, and that is level design. I suppose something had to give somewhere. I'd love to be as verbose as I have and will continue to be about the rest of the game when it comes to this side of things, but it's tough as it's just so forgettable. Criminal Origins is incredibly linear, even if it sometimes does just enough that you're tricked into thinking otherwise. Each area has a fairly distinct look in terms of the objects within it, but every single one, no matter the size, ends up feeling like one long corridor. Every now and then paths will split, but usually only for the briefest of interludes while you track down a certain item needed to unlock the route forward. Those items come in the form of axes, sledgehammers, shovels and crowbars, which are used to break open doors or bypass obstacles. Keys being weapons you can also use to bludgeon your foes with is a novel idea, but with level design generally being incredibly simplistic and Ethan moving with all the speed of a 2-legged tortoise and with not much more enthusiasm, exploring isn't anywhere near as mechanically engaging as it could have been, despite some nice touches. There is one level I'd argue is one of the greatest slices of video game horror you'll ever likely encounter, Bart's department store. Different enemies are introduced and story beats regularly break up gameplay during other levels to keep proceedings fresh, but it's only the department store which feels like a truly considered linear sequence of scares that goes above and beyond the familiar format. Ethan has already begun to hallucinate by the point you arrive there, so you're never quite sure what's real and what's not, and the way Monolith builds tension and plays with your expectations as you push on through the store's corridors is exquisite. First you see a few inanimate mannequins, later followed by what looks like someone dressed as one. Then there's a stretch of not seeing any at all, before they gradually begin to appear more frequently, still unmoving, until you're eventually attacked by those disguised as them. If you're observant and manage to spot those hiding, you might even realise you're in trouble before everything gets too out of hand. From then on, you'll come across 1,000,001 mannequins, and if you're anything like me, will near freeze in place every time you see them. You've a right to be scared too, as a lot of them are definitely out for your blood. Towards the end of the level, Monolith throws in mannequin hallucinations as well, as if the immensely frightening real ones weren't enough. Honestly, I could make an entire video on this small slice of the game alone, it's that good. And you know what, maybe someday I will. Even with level design being a tad disappointing elsewhere, the exceptionally gloomy atmosphere and acute feelings of claustrophobia, combined with unnerving audio, more than make up for it. I can't think of many games released since Condemned which evoke quite the same feelings of crushing despair. It's a title so uniquely of its time. That might be true in story terms too, as I'm not sure you'd get away with its plot in the present. Unfortunately, when it comes to story, Condemned is as unhinged as many of the denizens who inhabit its nightmarish locales. It's all so brilliant for such a long time too, which makes Monolith's inability to stick the narrative landing all the more maddening. After escaping the police towards the start of the game, Ethan continues the hunt for the man who killed his colleagues, and not long after it's revealed the mysterious murderer also has a vested interest in our hero's career.
Processing image. Interesting. Initial scan indicates 18 newspaper clippings, 11 from our own evening edition, 7 from nearby community papers, all with the same theme: serial killers. Most of them different, but all of them are cases you've worked on. Some have markings in a black felt tip pen. Still running frequency analysis on the markings to see if we can guess what they mean.
In addition, it turns out the unknown maniac in question, dubbed Serial Killer X, is not the matchmaker, who is found murdered in the department store displayed similarly to his own victims. Concluding that Serial Killer X is in fact himself hunting down serial killers, Ethan then searches for another known as the Torturer, who he believes is X's next target. He eventually locates the Torturer, who has been tortured to death himself, after which Serial Killer X finally emerges from the shadows. His name is Leyland Van Horn, nephew of Malcolm Van Horn, and he intends to do away with Ethan, having finished using his work to pursue his victims. Malcolm, however, manages to lock Leyland up in the back of his car, and in the game's final moments you can choose to spare him or kill him. The outcome is the same regardless, either you shoot Leyland or he shoots himself. Ethan then meets Rosa in a diner where she asks him if he was part of a cult, more on that momentarily, and she reveals she's wearing a wire, at which point the end credits roll. If that was the entirety of the story, I'd call it a home run. While Ethan isn't the most riveting main character and his supporting cast is decidedly flimsy, the overarching plot slots right in alongside the rest of the Condemned experience pretty much perfectly tonally. However, I've deliberately only shared half of what happens. There is also an altogether less realistic side to the tale Monolith weaves, one which takes greater precedence the further you progress, one which absolutely did not need to be included. During your travels, you might come across birds in varying states of decomposition. They act as one of two types of collectibles along with metal pieces, and through internal FBI reports displayed during loading screens, it slowly unfolds that a sonic disturbance is not only responsible for them dying, but is also affecting humans too. This particular report makes that abundantly clear, stating that those inherently predisposed to violent tendencies slip rapidly towards a host of mental psychoses and begin to exhibit signs of hallucinations, homicidal behaviour and paranoia. The police are struggling to deal with the resulting rise in crime, as evidenced during the level set on Metro City's streets which follows. Ethan is having problems of his own, suffering from intense hallucinations, or perhaps precognition, throughout the game, and Rosa also reveals that his personnel file details several anomalies, such as abnormally high bone density and a redacted X-ray of his vocal cords. It turns out some sort of cult is responsible for everything going on, with the disfigured fellow you battle during the game's climax either responsible for it or at minimum heavily involved. Malcolm believes the sonic disturbances are also why Leyland lost his mind, a plausible enough theory given the havoc they've wrought everywhere else. He's been trying to save Leyland because he believes there's still some chance of redemption. Ethan isn't immune to their influence either. After meeting Rosa in the cafe, he heads to the bathroom, where the game ends on a cliffhanger. In essence, there are two strands to Condemned's story, the gritty crime thriller and the supernatural horror. The problem is the complete dissonance between them. While the supernatural side of things is hinted at from an early stage and pops up throughout, it actively lessens the effect of the more realistic and intriguing side of the story. Playing the role of a disgraced FBI agent hunting down a serial killer killing other serial killers in a city on the verge of collapse is a strong thread. Being stalked by a metal-faced cult member who randomly appears and whose motives are never really explained is not. That so much of the cult's side story is fleshed out using loading screens many may not even bother paying attention to says so much about the way the whole thing is handled. It is completely at odds with what the rest of the game is seemingly trying to achieve. The argument could be made that better integration of the down-to-earth and the supernatural would have solved a lot of Condemned's issues, but personally, I think the sillier side of the story should have just been cut entirely. I just cannot see what it adds to the experience as a whole. On the bright side, as discussed earlier, the optics of a government employee beating poor downtrodden people to death aren't brilliant, and the paranormal part of Criminal Origins does at least help soften that particular blow. Something I pay a lot more attention to nowadays is a game's length. In the not too distant past, I'd often view the topic in a very binary manner, longer is better and very short is bad, whereas these days it's much more about whether a title's runtime best fits the experience that is offered. Condemned Criminal Origins is a title where I think the two complement each other perfectly. If Condemned was a 10, 15 or even 20-hour affair, I'd struggle to recommend it to even the most hardened horror fanatics. At 4 or 5 hours, maybe 6 at a push, it's a cracking little title with a lot to offer. Its combat remains enjoyable in the present, and the almost overpowering atmosphere and gritty aesthetic which accompany it are terrific, with level design being the only big gameplay letdown. One half of the story is solid, while the other half is putrid, the game's biggest issue, but with Criminal Origins not being the most narrative-heavy title, it shouldn't be too much of a struggle to look past that particular aspect. If you're looking for something scary, something rather unique, something that won't break the bank, I cannot recommend Condemned enough. It's a deeply unsettling rollercoaster which still chills to this day. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and FBI agents who have no choice but to explore a horrifying and violent underworld. If you had a terrifyingly good time, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing your thoughts, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon.